All right, we are back recording. Thank you for joining today, our conversation with Dr. Virginia Mapedzahama about confronting whiteness. And I just want to open by doing a smudge and honoring all of our ancestors. So I want to pay respects to the ancestors of the lands on which we're meeting, and everybody who watches this in future, the ancestors of the land that you are on, and the ancestors of our lineages. And as Virginia is a Shona woman, thank you to the Shona ancestors of Zimbabwe supporting her and supporting this work in particular, and all the ancestors in spirit, human and non-human, support us to live and be here today. So we are here today to talk about a core experience in Virginia's life, which is confronting whiteness. So let me start by just asking you the big question, Virginia. What is whiteness?
Thank you for that. You know what I was thinking before I actually answer that question, I was like, actually, I don't even know, like, is confronting whiteness the phrase, or like, should it be navigating? Because I feel like in my life, yes, I do confront it, but I do navigate it. And as well, I'll talk about later, I hope it will come out in our conversation or in our dialogue, that sometimes I actually benefit from whiteness and the fact that I can speak white. So I do benefit from that. So it's, yes, confronting it because it has a huge impact in my day-to-day lived experiences in Australia, but also so to me, I think navigate is more it's the thing that I think of the most, because it's kind of this going back and forth and like adjusting, and then, like, as you and I have discussed over a lot of conversations, Valerie, it's also like a realization that, hang on, like, I've been doing this, that is actually part of white, colonial whiteness and stuff. So it's, yeah, so there's all these so there's all these navigations that keep happening. So yeah, so I think thinking more in the framework of navigating will probably be the thing, because I feel like confronting is more like, I am, like, I'm challenging whiteness, which I do sometimes. But again, Valerie, you know this, that a lot of the times I don't challenge it. I do challenge it in conversations with people that I know will kind of understand my position, but generally the people that I should be talking to, I don't.
Yeah,
So
that's part of it, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily safe to confront it all the time. So as you say, part of that is navigating which battles you choose and when and why. Yeah. So help us out. How do you think about and put a framework around whiteness?
So for me, whiteness actually, and I say this to a lot of people because they think whiteness is just about being white, and it relates to the, like, just embodying the body that can pass racially pass as white. But for me, and a lot of other, like, critical race theories, whiteness is actually a hegemonic system of power that actually differentially, like, or that really determines who gets privilege and who doesn't in society based on this thing called race, based on these phenotypical features. And that the hegemonic power that it has, or the way that it actually, like, maintains itself in cultures, is through, like, very different power dynamics in things like even language. So even the way that you speak. And Valerie, I hope you will remind me to talk about this when I talk about how I speak white.
Yes.
So it's through things like language, through things like religion, like class, obviously, race relations, sexual orientation, all of these other things that are actually very much embedded in cultures, and there's all these power dynamics that work through all that. So for me, whiteness isn't, it is, yes, of course, about passing as white, racially passing as white, but the main thing that it is actually it is a hegemonic system of power.
Right. And so you have this dual experience. So you grew up in Zimbabwe, but you did Anglican schooling and you did schooling in English. And I remember you telling me this story about how even when you were doing Shona literature courses, that
Yeah.
you had to write your assignments in English.
Yeah, not just the assignment, but the main exam, we had to write it in. Well, you didn't have to. You could write it in English, but it was just a well-known, like open secret that if you wrote it in English, you passed. If you wrote it in Shona, you didn't pass, which is the most ridiculous thing. Now, you know what makes it all really crazy is that when all of this was happening, like growing up, I didn't actually question these things at all. Like I never questioned it until I came to Australia. This is when, so I always say to people, like, I wasn't Black until I came to Australia. So I've written a paper on becoming Black because for me, yeah, I might have already always been in this skin and in this body that's, obviously defined as Black, but it was until I came to Australia that I actually started experiencing my body as Black. Now, for some people who may listen to this later, who are actually Zimbabwean and a little bit older, who actually would have been a bit older during the colonial Smith period, um, they would be saying, well, actually, we always knew our bodies are Black because we were treated like Black people. Now, mind you, I was 5 years old before, when Zimbabwe got its independence. So in my knowing days, I've always known it to be a Black rule kind of country. But I know that even people who are older than me have always experienced their bodies as Black. So I remember having these conversations with my father, where, like we're talking and complaining about Mugabe and what he's done and killed the country and all of these things. And my dad was like, yeah, he may have done that, but at least, I'm not being treated like garbage just because I'm a Black man, you
Mm.
know. And I don't have a young or a little white boy, like, either telling me what to do or, really
I mean,
make me
you
feel
in
like
your own
that.
country.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, in my own country, just because I'm a Black person. So for people like that, they've always experienced their bodies as Black. But for me, that happened when I came to Australia, more than 20 years ago, that I started realizing that actually there's certain things that um, I won't ever be able to partake of because of the color of my skin. There's certain things that I always have to prove myself because of the color of my skin. There's certain things that will always happen to me, again, because of the color of my skin, and also because of the way that I talk, because obviously I speak with a different accent. So
Mm.
it's like my body speaks a language of its own,
Mm.
and you always have to to unwrite, that writing that my body, that is put on my body.
You're
Just
always dealing with those projections when you walk into a space, and then you're basically having to be an ambassador. Like, whatever your projections are, let me try to show you who I actually am.
and it's exhausting. It really is exhausting because, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're walking into predetermined space. Like, this space has already been determined for me, and my job is to, like, get people out of that, like, this headspace that they're in relation to the Black body. So for me, like, I experience whiteness on that level, like on the everyday, day to day, like, lived experience, like, just the physicality of it. I experience it, and that's in the interpersonal relationships as well, that I experience whiteness, and then I also experience it in the more systemic things that, why I had to leave academia, for example, because of the just the whiteness of it. And in Australia, it's not even like on anybody's agenda to, like, even talk about the white system of privilege and how that's being maintained through Australian universities. I know other universities overseas, like in America and Canada, they're starting to unpack that, but Australia, we're not even anywhere near that, because the focus in Australia is always that, on sameness. So I always argue that Australia has this narrative of like sameness, like we're all the same, like we're all here, and we're all good. I mean, we talked about that in the previous dialogues anyway, but all of those issues for me um, are part of this bigger, like I said, this bigger hegemonic system that I call whiteness.
Will you talk about that a little bit, about how here you are, a expert in critical race and its application in your life, and also a lot of immigrants across Australia, and you end up working for a white man of Irish ancestry who's doing the largest like racism research project in Australia. So you still end up behind this whitewash screen in order for some of these messages to, filter out to the public. Would you talk a bit about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of a strategy that I thought, oh, okay, I'll have this strategy. And this was during my academic days where I thought, okay, this is the only way that I can get my message out. It didn't work, by the way. I just gotta say it didn't work. But yeah, and one of my really good friends who's he's an African American guy was very, very appalled when I went to work for this guy, because he was like, after all the conversations we've had about whiteness and about this, like, seriously, you're going to work for this person? And I was like, well, look, we're in Australia, it's different. And I feel he has the speaking position, right? He has the speaking position, he has the microphone, and people, when he speaks, he commands an audience. I might as well be part of the people that are just seen to be in his, within his vicinity. And I might borrow some of that speaking positions or use it to create my own platform over here that I can then kind of, chat for people of color. And this was obviously within academic context. Now, this is someone who has he has a lot of clout in terms of policies and people coming to him and getting the research money that matters and all of this stuff. So he's like, you can't talk racism in Australia basically without mentioning his name. I'm not going to mention it here in case it comes across, but people will know who I'm talking about. So he has that much clout. But I had so many conversations with him during the time that I was working there that I'd go home and I'd just be like, oh no. and this is what I was saying, navigating whiteness, because not once did I actually voice any of that, because at the end of the day, you're like, keep your eye on the ball. This is about following, like borrowing the speaking position so you can create your own. Didn't happen, because in the end I actually ended up resigning over what I felt was actually a race-based decision that was made anyway. And I didn't do anything about it. I just resigned. And then years later, another African woman called me up and said, hey, I want to know about your experiences with these people, because then she was experiencing similar things. And it made me feel a little bit bad, because I thought if I had spoken up a bit more, maybe we could have fixed things, but I didn't. So there's that kind of navigation, and unfortunately the way that we navigate it sometimes means it makes it easier for whiteness to reproduce itself, and for anti-Black racism to reproduce itself. Now, I know in Australia we don't talk about anti-race Black racism at all, because I mean, we don't fancy ourselves as a racist. Like, we want to think that we're not racist at all, which I don't know how we can say that of a whole nation. Say Australia is not racist is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But we like saying that. So unfortunately, that never really like goes anywhere. So yeah, so there's this self-censorship. So even though I used that strategy to go and work for this person, I found myself in a lot of self-censorship situations. I've told you, Valerie, of some situations where I've been working with him and I've voiced some things like, and I don't want to say them now because again, this is going to be on the public forum. So at the risk of identifying, I'm not going to go into that, but there were so many situations where even when I felt when I've like pushed back a bit,
You were shut down. You told me you were
yeah,
told, "Oh, why are you being emotional?" Like it's like,
yes,
well,
exactly. So it was,
obviously you're emotional because it matters to you.
yeah, exactly. And this is what happens all the time. Like people, I have been asked this in like when people come to you and they like, which is very interesting, like where sometimes people come to you and they ask you, how are you going? Like, how are you experiencing this and that? And hey, do you ever experience any racism? And you're like, oh yeah, like that's literally a part of my lived reality. Like my life is about, once I step out of my house, I mean, I do have obviously comfort zones where like I'll step out of my outside my house, and if I step out of my house, get into my car, go to my work, that's fine. Like I'm okay. I'm not gonna do like that's I'm not experiencing racism. But if I step out of my house, get onto the train, go into a shop, then going to work, I guarantee you at some point along that line, a race-based decision about me will be made. Unless I try not to even like interact with anyone, or I try to completely block it. I guarantee you that a race-based decision will be made, or reaction, or something like that. That happens to me. Like I said, that's whiteness manifesting itself in my life on a day-to-day, everyday, what I call everyday racism basis. Um,
So
and
that
so,
could be somebody looking at you weird on the train. That could be somebody following you a little bit around a shop, right?
yeah,
It's these small actions, and you get that feeling like,
yeah.
oh, you're treating me different. Yeah.
Yeah, microaggressions they call them, but they're not so micro when you're experiencing them. But like I might have told you or Paula when we were still working in the city, that the first time that I was working there, and I went to the pharmacy that was downstairs, and I was just looking. Actually, I was looking for. This was before I got like prescription glasses, so I was still buying those. Um,
Like reading glasses.
reading glasses, and I went there and I was just looking around, and and it took me a moment to realize there was only the pharmacist and another girl that was there and me. And it took me a moment to compute that the girl had, as soon as I stepped in, the girl had come out, and each aisle I went into, she would stand at the beginning of the aisle, and I moved into it's a very small shop, and it was very clear and very evident. And I thought, I'm sorry, I'm wearing this thing that's dangling, that shows that I work somewhere near here. I'm holding my phone, and my wallet, and you can clearly see this is someone coming somewhere from work. I'm dressed professionally. Like, you don't need to follow me around. I'm not your problem. Like, I don't know who has robbed you before or done something, but it's not me. Like, and that kind of thing where you're like, I don't understand. Why is this person following me throughout the shop? There's nobody else, and there's cameras all over. You really don't need to surveil me in this way. And so things like that leave you very, like, at an interpersonal level, it kind of damages you somehow in terms of
Feeling just safe in society, right? Just that you
yeah,
through the world. And you and I talk about this sometimes, how in Australia, when we compare with other countries from that research and knowledge perspective in the Western science way, that Australia doesn't collect information on race, right? So even those studies about racism, they're asking questions like, what language do you speak at home, and what country were you born in? And they're not actually, as you say, asking about phenotype or racial identification.
yeah. And that's something that really stresses me out, as you know, because Australia, again, that's because of that. I think because we have this discourse on narrative of sameness. So we're like, I know we're like, we're multicultural, but really our multiculturalism is only celebratory. It's not genuine multiculturalism or critical multiculturalism. It's in actually sitting down and saying, what does this actually mean? Like, if I'm saying, oh, Virginia, we welcome you, she's going to come with a whole different way of speaking, way of doing this, and then I have to, like, I know some things that I did know about people that look like Virginia, or people that come from a country that Virginia is coming from. Like, I have to unlearn all of this stuff. That hasn't happened in Australia. And you try to talk to people about that. Even, what's really sad is, like, people who are actually in the quote unquote critical race studies in Australia.
Mm.
Like, and I'm talking about those big guns, so to speak, because they collect this data. And even the census, as you know, it doesn't collect data on, it collects data on, like, country of migration, I think, or parentage. Um, and
Aboriginality.
and aboriginality. So, and I remember having these conversations when I was working for this person, like having these conversations going, well, actually, this goes maybe to ethnicity perhaps and to ancestry, but it doesn't go to race. Because if you look at my daughter, for example, she might say that, because you say, do you identify as blah, 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 and she'll identify as Australian because actually that's what she identifies as, right? And then you will say, what language do you speak at home? Well, she actually speaks English because I speak to her in English, right? Do you speak any other language? No, because she doesn't speak any other language. I do, right? And so and they might ask her about where were your parents born, right? So they might be able to tell that she's African, but they won't be able to tell that she's actually a person of color. So the same thing could happen, should answer in exactly the same way as a white Zimbabwean's child, because the majority of the South Africans who are in Australia and the Zimbabweans who are in Australia are actually of British and Irish heritage. So they're not actually, so there's over like, I think nearly 200,000 of the, so South Africa has the highest number of migrants in Australia. And anecdotally speaking, we know that the majority of that are white people who racially pass as white from South Africa, who are of British or Irish background, who came when the period of apartheid ended. So there was a mass migration from then, et cetera, et cetera. So we know those things anecdotally speaking, but statistically, we can't actually say who is who. And I've spoken to people about the advantage of actually asking direct questions about race, and not in a racist way, but in a way of trying to understand if this is what if we want to understand racism, let's ensure that we're talking to people who actually identify as or identify or are identifiable phenotypically as non-white, right? Because if someone, and we talk about you and I, for example, that you don't identify as white, but when you walk down the street, people would identify you. So you racially pass, even though identification is one thing, but racial passing is something that we have to be very much aware of. And to be aware of the fact that race and ethnicity are not the same thing. Very much related, but not the same thing. So if you're asking questions that go to ethnicity, they don't tell you about race, and you miss a whole like kind of data.
Yes, yes.
You know, so that stresses me out a lot that Australia refuses to do that. And when I've suggested that, obviously America is always given as an example of what not to do. It's like, well, look how racist America is because they ask questions about race. It's as if you ask that question, then you create racism. Like, no, you don't actually. But what happens is if you want to really know what's going on with people of color in terms of experiences of racism, then you actually know that the people that are answering the questions are the people that it's the group that really experiences this in life. So for example, those surveys that are thrown around, 1 in 5 Australians experience racism. It's like, well, who did you ask?
Well, and if it's 1 in 5, does that mean that those 20% of people, like, who are those people? Are they people who have, Black or Asian or Southeast Asian skin or whatever? Like, who is that 20%? Yeah.
Right. And I asked that question before, and nobody could answer that question because they can't. They don't know.
That's where we need stories, right? Like I have a story that really I felt really strongly growing up in the U.S. around a lot of African Americans. My school is predominantly African American, and I remember there was a mother who was Anglo American, and she'd married an African American man. Her children were phenotypically a lot darker, looked different to her, and she said until she had married and become part of the family, had the children she never woke up in the morning worried that her husband or her children were going to get shot that day just living their life before they came home. And now she worries that every single day, every single morning she wakes up and she's worried that they will just be the victim of some, police violence, um, moving through the world, just going to school, going to their job, living their simple life, right? So how do we capture that if we don't make the space for all of these stories of lived experience? And then that data only goes so far, but if we're blocking even the level of the data, then we're blocking even deeper stories, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
But I have been told, like when I've been told, you're absolutely right. And I have been told when I've tried to bring this up, like in my academic circles, that, for example, stories don't really, they're not useful. Like in these spaces, what we need is hard statistics and things that will move policymakers. And in a way, I mean, they do, because when policymakers hear 1 in 5 Australians, they're like, oh, really, 1 in 5? But it's like, well, even that statistic that you're grabbing onto is not real. Because if you, I've done research on racism amongst African migrants in Australia, and not one single person that I spoke to said, oh, no, 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 we don't experience racism in Australia, Virginia. Not one single person. Mind you, that was qualitative research. And so it's always dismissed because it's coming up with stories, and I tell stories. I'm a storyteller, so I tell stories out of my data. And so
But
people are
this
like,
is
yeah,
part
but
of
how do you,
whiteness, right? This is part of navigating whiteness, because part
this,
of that whole structure, as you talk about the sameness, I would put the words of universalizing, right? So it's like we want to universalize. So we'll just look at this big data rather than recognizing that each of those points of data is a human being with a lived experience, and some of those people are in a lot of pain. And
Mhm.
so when we start seeing certain things in the data, then that's where we want to go in from your qualitative perspective. We actually want to unpack and look at that pain, and we want those stories, case studies, etc., so that we can understand, well, what's actually happening on the ground. I mean, what does it mean that 20% experience racism? If we don't have stories to understand what actually they're experiencing, then what influence is that going to have on policy anyway?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't actually. That's the truth, because it hasn't done anything. All it's done is shock the nation, right? And mind you, neither has our stories. But this is again what you're saying, like navigating whiteness as a system and the structural nature of it. In that, even within academic circles, when people of color's research is dismissed as well as in, yeah, you might be doing good. And I have been told when I've been doing this research, like, yeah, what you might be doing, it's going to get you publications, it's going to get you probably promoted. But even then, you got to really think carefully if you're focusing on African migrants. First of all, how many of them are there? Secondly, how many of them are even experiencing racism? Thirdly, like, I mean, if they're coming here as skilled, like, who even wants to know about that? And I've been told this by highly, highly renowned academics in the area of like cultural studies or migration studies or race studies, and I've had
There's still
literally.
this hierarchy, right? Like, oh yeah, you and your people, your problems are not really that big or important.
Well,
But you're reminding me of this conversation we had where we were talking with someone who is leading an organization, and she said, yes, I do understand that, basically we end up with being able to show information about aboriginality and then non-aboriginality, so everybody who's called, which is a label, culturally and linguistically diverse, that neither of us heard outside of Australia, all of a sudden we're all lumped into this category. You're aboriginal, you're called, or you're Anglo-Australian. These are the three options of identity here, right? um that everyone who's called feels invisible, but it is what it is. We've got to deal with our Indigenous people and make sure we put them first and make that right, kind of thing. And we're sort of like, so how could you possibly make that right if you're acknowledging that you're invisibling all these other people? I
yeah,
don't understand.
yeah, it's really very interesting. One of my postdoc advisors said, and she wasn't saying this in a kind of nasty way or anything. She was just like pointing it out. She said, Virginia, like, I really feel very strongly about this, but I get really frustrated because um yeah, like you said, we have never ever dealt with, when it comes to race, we've never dealt with the race issue in relation to our Indigenous Australians. We've never, like, we skirt around it. We skirt, well, the whole thing is based on a system of like whiteness. Like, this is why we're in trouble, because we're just like, we're not like looking at ourselves and the system that's leading us to do these things, and we kind of want to say, oh, let's improve this aspect of indigenous lives, and or let's do this, and we're not actually going to the core of it. So she said to me, I know you're going to do this, you're going to look into it, but I don't feel like there's going to be any change unless and until we actually confront our own whiteness. And
Mm.
she was like, and the chances of that happening in Australia, I don't know, like, for me it's 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 a losing battle. So there's that thing of like, we're not really looking at what does it mean to say, like, we're looking at Indigenous Australians, and then there's called, the whole idea of called is just one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard. And yeah, if you look at the ABS website and the way that they say who is called, actually it's so broad, because it used to be very narrow, and it used to be like absolutely, like you could see the race-based nature of it, but without them saying race-based. So it was quite racist. And so I don't know who like tapped them on the shoulder and said, you know, you have to change it. And it's now so broad that the only people not captured by that category are actually Indigenous Australians.
Right. Basically, someone with a culture.
Which doesn't even make sense, because Indigenous Australians have the richest culture that not just here in Australia but worldwide. So it's just like, yeah, it doesn't even. So it's like, well, if it's so broad to encompass everybody else,
And what is it doing?
why do we need it, right? So they've tried, as you know, like the organization that we used to work for tried to call it something I can't even remember. It's such a ridiculous word that they tried to call it NMES or something I can't remember.
Non-majority Australian something, yeah.
Something, yeah. They called it NMES, which was also another equally ridiculous phrase. But
it's like
yeah.
that. This is part of the crux of whiteness, right? Is that there's something centered that everybody is like, all right, you don't seem to realize you're centered, or that these values and these ways of being are centered, and all of a sudden everything else is measured up against that, and the rest of us are trying to show you what you're centering, and that actually is dehumanizing not just all of us but you too. And still, as you say, it's so, I mean, as you talk about, right, there's a danger to calling that out, right? um so you have these experiences in jobs where this is your actual, material survival. If you call that out, you might be threatening that, right?
Yeah, and I never, like I said before, that's why I said maybe it's navigating rather than confronting, because you and I have had these conversations where, you know, sometimes a little bit, doesn't even happen like that a lot in Australia either, but sometimes you get the sense that people are coming to you to rubber stamp something, right? So it's not even being a token something, because officially you're not even on record being that tokenistic. So it's one thing to be like a token where you're like being put in this position where you're tokenistically there. This is only like in the background kind of thing that they come to you and have these conversations and they're like, right? And I'm like, yeah. And you're like, yeah, you totally get it. And you're like, no, you don't. But how do I tell you? Because you have so much power over me right now. And I feel so there's this self-censoring that is so painful that you have to do as a person of color living in a white dominated society that's not critical of its whiteness, that you have to all the time. I remember having conversations with one of my colleagues in the past, and he has since returned home because he was just like, I can't deal with this. He's since returned home to Africa because he was just like, I can't do it, because it's like, I cannot handle the self-censorship, where particularly when it comes to matters of race. Because I mean, if you want to get out, like ostracized, is that the word? Ostracized very quickly as an academic, is try and raise these voices, these things that we're discussing here in an arena that's outside of, say, like your field of research. So yes, in Australia, in fact, a lot of the conferences that I used to go to were those conferences that were where people are already that way researching in that space anyway, or so it's safe space.
Yeah,
But outside
but you're talking in like an echo chamber. You're all just reinforcing, yes, this is my experience, this is what I'm picking up, this is what I'm picking up, but you're not penetrating outside of that space.
Exactly. So when you're in that space, but even in that space, you sort of like you're moderating yourself, because you're like, you're trying to gauge where everybody else is at, and you're like, okay, I can push it this far, I can't push it this far, like you. So you, even in that space, you moderate yourself. Like I remember telling you like a paper that I wrote, which is online, and I presented at the Australian Sociological Association. It was called where it's titled, "Where Are You From?" And I can't remember the rest of it. All I remember is where you're from. I think if anyone types like Virginia Mapedzahama, where are you from, in quotation marks, that paper will come up. And it's not even that groundbreaking a paper, right? It's not even that deep. It's just a paper that we wrote because we were frustrated by being
asked that, being asked that,
all the time. And I was living in Sydney, and I would say to people like, oh, I'm from Adelaide. And I get excited about, like, let me tell you about Adelaide, right? And people are like, yeah, but no,
Where are
like,
you really
where
from?
you really from? I'm like, I'm really from Adelaide. Like, honestly, like, I lived in Adelaide. And people will be like, yeah, but we mean before that, dear. Like, you obviously don't look like you're from Adelaide. You look like you're from somewhere else. And then you have to say, oh, before that, I was in Zimbabwe. So you have to like eventually go there. But even when we wrote that paper, the person, one of the reviewers said, I found this paper very irritating or annoying, or very annoying to read. I found this paper very annoying, full stop.
Mm.
However, it's a good paper. So the first sentence had to be, I found this paper very annoying. Didn't explain, didn't exaggerate, didn't like anything. But what I did, and that made me cry, because I was like, really? And so even in those spaces, because this person who's reviewing the paper is supposed to be an expert in the area that I'm writing, but they find it appropriate to say the first sentence to say, I found this paper annoying, and doesn't explain, doesn't expand on it. The next sentence says, however, it's a really good paper that must be accepted for publication and presentation. It's like, then why did you say that first sentence? If you're saying let's accept it anyway, and you have very minor corrections or edits on it, like, you could have just done away with that. So you can't help but saying, well, clearly it wasn't a person of color who reviewed this, clearly, because if they were,
Especially because they said however, right? So it's like, I
yeah,
found it annoying, however. Yeah, because it's not like I felt, this kinship with the experience described in the paper.
yeah,
It's like, oh,
yeah.
this was hard to read, but it is valuable. Let's get it out in the world,
Yeah,
right?
and but I do give the person some credit, because they did actually manage to get over the whatever their annoyance was, to actually say it's a good paper, and then give some very good feedback on the paper itself and the content and the structure and everything. So on that basis, it's like, well, actually, thank God you were able to go above your, like,
Past
beyond
those feelings,
out
yeah.
of yourself, right? But that's what I'm saying. So that self-censorship, even in those spaces where there's supposed to be that we're supposed to be all on the same page, as are the same people, you still have to measure yourself. And when I gave that paper in person, there was just this like dead silence in the room, like nobody said anything. So I gave two papers at that conference. One of them was about racism in nursing, and there was so much discussion around that. People were like, yeah, it was very engaging. Then when I gave the second paper like a day later or something, that one about where you're from, because obviously it was written reflexively. So this is about me. This is
Yeah.
not about me reporting some research I did. This is about me, my life. And I've turned it into language that you all understand, which is academic. And it was just dead silence, like zero.
But
And
that's
then,
confronting, right? Because you were confronting people, because you were just actually being very real and open about what it is like to be you in that space.
yeah. And then also, like, afterwards, the person, like, people then started commenting, and they said, oh, but people often ask that just as a, like, starting to make like conversations and doing, so there was this
Potential for
defensiveness.
sentences.
And
Yeah.
it's like, well, actually, we're not writing from your point of view. Like, you think you're starting the conversation, think about the other person hearing you asking them. And mind you, you're not the first person to ask me that today, right? Let alone yesterday and the day before. It's like, how am I supposed to feel like I belong if you keep reminding me I don't belong?
Yeah.
Like, you understand, from your point of view, why don't we talk about the weather, right? We want to relate. Let's talk about how hot it is.
Yeah.
And if you want to really know about me, I will tell you without you asking. Trust me, you don't have to ask, because it will come out, because it's part of who I am. And I'll tell you how my belonging is very fractured, because I belong in several spaces at the same time, and I don't belong in, you know what I mean? Like, I'm more complicated than my skin
Let's
color.
talk about that, right? Because you grew up as a Shona woman, but you also grew up in a lot of these white structures, and you went through this formal schooling. And then you came to Australia, where, like you're saying, you became very confronted with your blackness, and then did a PhD to sort of unpack for yourself. All right, what is my Shonaness? What is my blackness? What is my Australian political identity? What is going on here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's this is why, like, I've come up with this theory of a fractured belonging, that is a way of belonging that I don't, I actually just belonging in one space. But yeah, this idea of like, who am I is very complicated, because there's who I am as Virginia and the way that I see myself, which, by the way, and I say this to people all the time, it's like, actually, if you engage with me as a person, right, you just say, hey, Virginia, how are you? And like, you talk to me, what you realize is I'm more like you than any other African idea that you have. You know what I mean? Like, I'm actually more like you, which in itself is a source of pain for me to realize that I'm so white, right? But and that hurts it doubly, because you're like, I'm really more like you, but you're really like trying to get me, you know what I mean? Like, it's this kind of
You're trying to push
conflict.
me out of that. Yeah.
You're trying to push me out, but your people came and they colonized us and they turned me into something more like you. And then I come here and then you're like, no, you're not, go. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I don't win. But it was that was the sense that I got when I came to Australia. Again, it happened when I came here, because obviously when I was in Zimbabwe, I went through the exact same of level, like schooling that I remember having conversations with some of my friends, my academic friends, and I'll be like, this is how we grew up. We used to do this at boarding school. And they're like, just the idea of boarding school in itself, Virginia, like, that's so colonial. And I'd never actually asked these questions until I started having those conversations. And then one of the things that I've told you the story, Valerie, that the reason I speak with an accent that's so bastardized is because the boarding school that I went to was had a lot of American expatriates, because it was a Baptist school. And so a lot of the expats were from the US and whatever. And I remember like she was a lovely, 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 like lady who used to teach divinity of all the things. It wasn't even like English or anything, but she was so hell-bent on like getting us to know how to pronounce like words properly and like speak like proper English. And so I remember like we used to spend hours in class, like, of course, learning about the Bible, but also learning about how to read those things from the Bible correctly, like in the proper English.
Which is a
And
regression for
we
mine.
we would spend days where she'd be like, like you say, person. That's what we would say. And Shona would be like, person, because we don't roll our tongues. And then she'd be like, no, it's not person. It's like person. You got to roll your tongue, person. And so, Virginia was very, very good. She would be like, person, person. So then, and I used to get lots of lollies. Yeah, I used to get lots of lollies because I used to say the right things. And of course, here I am. I speak the way that I do. And that didn't even I didn't think anything of it until I started really critically looking at myself. And it's like, well, wow, it wasn't enough that we were speaking English already. What we had to do was to actually speak English in this way as well. So it was really interesting. And this lady, I don't know, it's just where she is, where she would be now, but it wasn't ill like meant. It was just something that she wanted us to speak properly. So it was just, that's how colonized I was by the time I came to Australia. But that's not enough, because it's still like, I think my blackness, I always say like my blackness is very disruptive to white space. So I don't have to do anything. I don't have to speak. I don't have to act. I just have to be in space, right? So just my mere presence disrupts space. So like I've seen people, like when you go onto the train and they turn to look at you. It's like, oh, is that an African woman? Is that a Black woman? And they turn around and then they like, she looks harmless, right? And then they continue with their day. So that kind of white gaze that's put on you because you're in a Black body. But yeah, I can't remember what question you asked because I'm going on and on. I've got so many.
No, it's good. Oh, I was just trying to give a little space to your Shona-ness, which
Yeah.
I feel like you've been unpacking again a lot more recently, because as you look back, you're like, okay, this was when I grew up, right? This was colonial, this was Christian, which is still important to me, but it also came from the colonists. And then this is Shona-ness, and this is traditional spirituality and cultural practices that actually some of them I do and don't do now. And that you've been unpacking that a lot more. I was going to ask you to talk a bit about Shona-ness for yourself.
Yeah, I have been unpacking a lot of that. And I must say, it's not sad, but it's a little bit like, as I unpack that a lot more, I actually realized just how much of a colonial product that I am, because a lot of the things that I embody are actually a product of colonialism. And I have taken those things so much on board that on a day-to-day basis, unless I consciously try to confront those things of myself, I'm actually, my default is actually to act in that way as a colonial person, because there were so many things, like even now talking to my family back home, that we say, and you know, like when my mom recently passed away, and there were some things that were happening, that we do in Shona culture, when someone passes, that even I told you, Valerie, and I was like, they're going to do this at her funeral, which I think, thinking as a Western person, I would think that's so ridiculous, but I know it holds meaning in my culture. So I'm having to do that kind of unlearning sometimes, and relearning my Shona, to say, well, actually, why do we do this in our culture? And even talking to my siblings and my family and saying, hey, hang on, like, we do this. And my family has been having a ball over this, because they're like, why do you want to know this, Virginia? And it's like, well, it's because that's who we are, right? And we need to know who we are, in relation to, you know, the role that colonialism had in our lives. But it's a very, very conscious act that I have to do, of really unpacking. And Shonaness in Australia, it's very difficult to be truly Shona in Australia, I'm not gonna lie. And very few people will get to see my real Shona, the Shona me. And so it's like I'm this kind of neurotic person, that I'm like, oh, here's Virginia, now she's the Shona woman, oops, too much, dial back, now I'm white again, or somewhat white. And it's like, oh, here's it. So it's always this, like, honestly, because if I acted like a real Shona person, a lot of the people that I interact with wouldn't actually interact with me, because it's quite different, right? And unless those people are actually open to really interacting with and negotiating difference. But I think a lot of people are very comfortable with me because I speak English quite well. I'm highly educated. I'm this. So they're quite comfortable with me, and they're quite comfortable with the way that I monitor my Shonaness, I guess. And so it's a real struggle. And I must say, a lot of the times I am more non-Shona than I'm actually Shona. I think I've told you, Valerie, like lots of times when I've tried even to speak in Shona around some of my friends, that they'll say, oh, Virginia, why don't you just say it in English? Like, we know you speak English. It's like, well, yeah, but this specific thing makes more sense. It's had more heart when I say it in my language. Like, and honestly, like, I can try and interpret it, like, and translate it myself, but it's not the same thing, right? So it's like, even at that basic level of just even speaking Shona is very different. It's very difficult. So there's always this, honestly, the way I can express my life living, or navigating whiteness in Australia, is it's a daily thing. Like, it's actually a moment to moment thing. There are some people that I'm very comfortable with, obviously, at an interpersonal level, that I will be as much Shona as I want, without actually having to censor myself. And you're one of them, Valerie. That and also, you've been on that journey with me, trying to get me to unpack like my actual Shonaness, and be able to kind of say, well, this is who Virginia is as a Shona woman, and this is who Virginia is in this Australian society, whatever that constitutes, right? And this person has to navigate. So there's that daily struggle to do that, because it's
How you show up. Yeah. I was
yeah.
gonna I was gonna ask you as a maybe a closing question from me. Like what would you say is the gift of that navigation and this wounding, that you put so much life energy into, being and unpacking? What do you feel like is a big gift of that?
Well, let me say this, like, this gift is packaged as a burden. But that's, so I again wrote this thing about the burden of blackness, which is like, you have to act in this like ways, and you have to navigate the world in the way that I've just been explaining. But I think one of the gifts that I think is changing people's perceptions of what it means to be non-white, and also getting people to really be aware of their own white privilege. Because I've had conversations with people that, when I tell my story, they like, oh, I didn't even know. Like, they're like, no, Virginia. And I tell them, and I have stories and stories and stories of the racism that I experienced on the bus, in the thing. And I remember having this conversation with one of my colleagues that I used to work with at our last organization. And I went to her after that incident happened in the pharmacy. I went up to her and I said, oh, hey, and sorry and sorry. And I said, hey, when you walk into a shop and they just like start racially profiling you, right? And I was so like, I want to talk about you in this thing. And she looked at me like, what? And she goes, no, Virginia, no, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that feels like. And we both laughed so much because I had gone with this, like, this is what I want to and tell you, like, like, let's talk about this thing that we know. And she's like, I don't know that happens to you, Virginia. It doesn't happen to people like me. In case you forgot, I pass as white. I am white. And so we have those kinds of conversations. So for me the gift isn't, I mean, she wasn't one of them, but I've had people who I've conversed with, and I tell them those kinds of stories, and they're like, oh my goodness, like I didn't know that this is real, right? Like this is actually other people's lived realities. Now let me look at how I'm so different in terms of how I live my day-to-day life and how I'm positioned within, like, in the system, the things that I don't have to worry about. When you go to an interview, I have to like be a different kind of person in an interview, because if I'm in a Zimbabwean woman and I speak like, like the way that actually African women are really, really meant to speak like this. People will be like, we don't really know if she speaks English really well, so maybe. So you have to worry about those things. But yeah, my good moments are when I have a conversation with some people and I can see the penny drop, and you're like, aha, you're at least you're getting like, it's a shift.
You're awakening people.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
and you're expanding their view of the
horizon.
world, of
Yeah,
themselves, of other people. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's
You're like
that's
you're
that's
like a human intervention. The blackness is like a living embodied intervention just being in the world.
yeah, yeah. But it's part of life, I suppose. We're put on this earth for a reason, and I guess that's my reason.
Here I am.
I guess he's appearing behind the wheel.
Hi, Virginia. Oh, and I've knocked off the medicine wheel. Thank you for sharing that. I always find it really challenging listening to you talk about your experiences, being, I think, in all of our dialogues, the only Anglo-Australian visitor or participant. So, but I did want to, I actually wrote my comment because I do this to keep my mind clear. So I feel like the challenge is that Australia has always been so ethnically centered that whiteness in the American / global conception is less applicable. And so in my experience, Aboriginal people have their own category of racial identity that in my own heart is worse than othering. It's resentment on a very deep level. So I had this phrase come to me that I call sort of insecure othering. It's to the extent to which you feel so insecure in yourself that when you are confronted by an other, you feel this fear or whatever it is, these things that you're experiencing. So for me, I feel like the challenge in Australia is that in so many ways, racial phenotyping, and this is all personal experience, like this isn't conceptual for me, this is actually what's inside my heart, is that in many ways, what we're talking about is degrees of insecure othering from an English Protestant center, of which racial phenotyping provides a convenient psychosocial means of doing the othering. So the whiter someone is, the more they can assimilate towards the center, but of course, never all the way. So Gladys Berejiklian can be white, but never at the ethnic center of an Australia dominated by an Anglo-Australian self-identity. So a person of color has got this hard racial boundary to assimilation. But when I'm trying to heal myself, like my question is, why do I have that boundary? Like, why is there this boundary that basically of otherness that people just can't cross no matter what they do? So for me, the wound driving that is a lack of grounded and sovereign sense of tribe, ethnicity, and land. So for me, unpacking whiteness has been helpful for learning the recently contrived nature of phenotyping, but it doesn't help me with that othering mechanism inside myself. And so as long as that's not healed, I'll always be racist because that racial phenotype will trigger the othering. So I guess that's where I'm sensitive to the way race is talked about in America, because it's sort of like, why are people so ungrounded that they have this othering machine inside themselves that basically never gets put away? So from this perspective, I do put a high priority of my healing work with Aboriginal people, because I feel like if I don't heal that fundamental wound, then that racial othering machine will just go and go and go, because I'll always be insecure in my sense of
About being
self.
here.
And so when I see someone like you just can't, like, there are other people who I might other, but they can pretend that I'm not othering them, because even though they're not Anglo-Australian, they can pretend that they look closer to it, but you never can. As you say, from your perspective, that you'll just never be able to be assimilated into that whiteness. But, you know, for me, it's like, why am I so insecure in myself? And I think some of that the racial discussion from the perspective of an Anglo-Australian, it doesn't go all the way to the center, because we put that ethnic identity right at the center.
Well, that's that to me, that's a big part of the whiteness wound that he's speaking to, right? Which is that sense of supremacy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's that the part of the whiteness navigating, confronting, is that there is this supremacy centered, and that is this, you know, perfect something that we all measure up to in different degrees, right?
Yeah, and it just so happens that in Australia, compared to America, our center is very ethnic. It is, we are a Anglo-Australian colony, straight up.
It's different to the US in that, yeah, there's so many, like, just in terms of the numbers of people, right? Like, there's so actually much more diversity in the US among people who identify as white, but also just general racial diversity compared to Australia. Yeah.
I mean, the White Australia policy didn't end until the 1970s in Australia. And that only happened because of the inconvenience of people who were that little bit less white. And it started to get ridiculous. Like, all right, Greeks and Italians, they got olive skin, so I guess that's white, because we need people to build the Snowy Mountain scheme.
I guess we'll let the Jews in. I guess we'll.
But we do a phenomenal job of othering those people. Like, they don't get othered because of racial phenotypes, but Anglo-Australians do a tremendous job othering them in everything. I mean, every single time I hear Gladys Berejiklian's name, every single time I feel this sense of alienation, every single time. Which is amazing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Whereas, and I, you know, like, I completely agree. Like, you just like put it so eloquently. I think it's just perfect. I think for me as well, it's that real thing about ethnicity, like ethnicity versus race, in Australia. To me, that's I don't know, because for me it's like I feel my race, then I feel my race and ethnicity, because they're all like, when people see me, they assume my ethnicity. But when I look at my daughter, this is where that really becomes very shaky.
Right.
Because like that distinction between ethnicity and race, and also like that her ethnicity is assumed, but it's really not, because she, or maybe her culture, maybe it's not necessarily just ethnicity, it's culture. And these phrases are kind of like, they bleed into each other. But for me, it's more like Tanatswa will walk around and she experiences the exact same thing. She just literally got fired from her job. In a move that I thought was quite race-based as well as anything else. But it's just like that, those things happen, and yet she's just as, in terms of like the way that she sees the world, again, like we're saying, like she quote unquote partakes of this like whiteness, of the structural whiteness in some ways, but she's also outside of it. And so for me, that's why I think even in my writing, race has been the thing, it's been the focus, to the exclusion of everything else. And I know that that's a little bit problematic in itself, but I think Australia, because Australia, like you said, Lucas, we don't do race very well. And we've never really questioned, as you so eloquently put it, like, why don't we do it? Like, why do we do this this othering of, you know, different races? And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Gladys, but we're out of time. But I have, and also I probably couldn't tell it in a public forum anyway, but there's an encounter I had.
I'm saying we don't just other race, we do a tremendous job of othering anybody who's not Anglo-Protestant.
Right.
It's just that it's degrees of othering from the center.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
a Greek person is more okay
Yeah.
than somebody who looks more, is racially black or whatever.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is at the core, this whiteness is based on
It's
this
layers.
yeah, but at the core, right, is this intense insecurity and this, which manifests outwardly as a sense of supremacy, which sounds like it's a cover for insecurity. Because from my perspective, I'm like, you actually don't know who you are. You're actually identifying as something that is not quite, human, tribal, grounded, etc. And
Yeah.
therefore you are innately feeling insecure because that identity by what you've tricked yourself into thinking you are supreme or whatever
Yeah.
is insecure. That is the nature of that, if that is your identity.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
very unfortunate because unfortunately that insecurity has been exported to other
Yes.
places and other spaces through colonialism, and then we've taken on that whole structure or that whole system with the insecurities, and we're coming into it. So it's kind of like, this is what I was saying, like it's like you can't win.
But that was deliberate.
Yeah,
That's
but
the
everybody
thing.
needs help. It's like for me, it's like an immense cry for help. It's like I am exporting my wounds across the whole world because I am so broken and I need everyone to be part of this crazy journey and help me.
But
right?
that was deliberate. I always think of us like a host for the racial ideas. So if you make people really insecure in their sense of tribal sovereignty and ethnic sovereignty, then they're a tremendous host to implant whatever ideas you want. In the case of Australia, it was very simple. No matter how much we shit on you, those Aboriginal people are not the same as you.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah.
They cannot be like you. So therefore,
which is the whiteness bribe, right?
And of course in America they had the slavery one, which was just so in their face and dominant in their experience. And oh my God, I mean,
what a beautiful mess that's been created that at least some of us are trying to unpack more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your wisdoms, and everybody who's joined us. Is there any last words that are coming to you that you want to close?
No, not really. Just to thank you for creating this space, and also the all the dialogues that have happened. The 4 of them. This is the last one. So yeah, that's been a really interesting series, and I hope that that continues in future, because it's just some really deep things that need to be discussed about going to the center of who am I as a human being, and how do I create a better world, I guess, for other human beings as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
I wish you a peaceful journey with the relentless, insecure othering of the white Australian.
It does help to have people, to have a community of people like you guys, like to really, because like I said, it's a journey, right? Like you have to unpack it, and because I have taken on that colonial wound myself, and it's also that, like, taking that cord off and kind of going, oh, there's Virginia underneath there, the Shona woman, hey, she peeks out, and then that's too much, like take her because at the end of the day, you are living in this world and you have to navigate it. That's just the plain truth. And Valerie and I, we talk about like that's like a more like I'm not the comfortable other, like it doesn't matter what I do, like I can't take the skin off, and it like I say, I always walk into predetermined space, and you've got to start from minus to do anything. And so on a lived day to day, I feel my race more than my ethnicity or my culture or anything else, because that judgment is based on the way that I look.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and thank you for all of the work that you do, being a human intervention in the world and confronting and navigating whiteness for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.